in a good Canadian fashion, I'll start by saying bonsoir. And the other thing is, I don't know if you do it here, but we do it there. I'm going to turn off my cell phone. I hope everyone's going to do the same thing. The last thing is the light that you see flickering here is actually not a screwed up aspect of their projector. They are beaming this lecture to Martians, and this is encrypted. So it's going to have to actually stay with us throughout the lecture. So we apologize for that. Cairo is not my native city. I'm not Egyptian, but I actually feel that I belong there, having spent so much time in there. So I allow myself to present it and to speak for it in many, many, many venues and under different guises. So today I will speak about actually modern Cairo. Normally I do speak about medieval Cairo. Of the many popular revolts rocking the Arab world, so Egypt is the one that's most captivated the Western imagination. Countless reports, images, cartoons, news analysis, YouTube videos, and scholarly essays, and now books, have documented every day and every turn of that most wonderful of popular uprisings, which managed in 18 days of mostly peaceful protests in Tahrir Square in Cairo and elsewhere to oust a dictator that has clung to his seat for the last 30 years. We all lived in euphoria of the triumph of the will of the people against their oppressors. And although the euphoria has lifted and the revolution's aftermath is settling in, we are still fascinated by what has happened in Egypt between January and February of 2011. And less so by what is currently happening, which may have something to do with the natural trajectory of revolutions. True, we may not yet have an Egyptian Marat or Robespierre, although they are in the making, nor may we ever have an Egyptian David or Delacroix or Beethoven or even Hegel or Marx. But we do have a collection of little Napoleons. And one of them may still surprise us and rise to the pinnacle of power on the debris of the old regime and the inability of the revolutionary youth to fast turn into shrewd politicians. There would be an ironic closure of sorts if Egypt's revolution were to spawn its own Napoleon. For the roots of the country's current complex situation, I submit, go back to the time of the Napoleonic invasion of Egypt in 1798. A moment that could have come down to us mainly as a cruel colonial farce if it were not for the chain of events it is conventionally purported to have unleashed. In his cunning speech, presumably delivered in Cairo in August of 1798 and translated into Arabic, Napoleon Bonaparte promised to lift Egypt from its medieval torpor, liberate it from its oppressors, and introduce it to the modern world where its glorious ancient heritage entitled it to be. This, as all colonial promises, did not come to pass. Although Muhammad Ali Pasha, who snatched the rule of Egypt in 1805, and his grandson Ismail, who ruled from 1863 to 1879, tried to modernize the country in an ultimately unsuccessful bid to catch up with the West. The British occupation of 1882 finished off whatever was achieved of that dream of independence and parity with the West, although it kept all of its formal and symbolic appearances and even built upon them. After 72 long years of British colonial rule, Egypt regained its political independence in 1954. But modernization remained ever the incomplete project. Gamal Abdel Nasser's ambitious socialist modernization, complete with land reforms and huge industrial projects, was no remedy. It was marred by erratic and autocratic national and Cold War politics and resulted in stilted advances in industrialization, education, healthcare, and redistribution of wealth. The defeat in the War of 1967 with Israel marked the end of Nasser's grand scheme of building a modern state that will lead a triumphant Arab nation with him at the helm. His successor, Anwar Sadat, while maintaining the military grip on political life in Egypt, shifted gears towards the West and towards political retrenchment and even retraction from a leading role in Arab affairs. He also introduced a statist form of neoliberalism that intensified under Hosni Mubarak. Despite the semblance of growth and the signs of accession to all the trappings of global economy, Egypt under Mubarak experienced more acute problems of urban and rural degradation, population explosion, and socio-economic inequality that have directly contributed to the eruption of the revolt of January 2011, whose consequences have yet to become legible. As capital of Egypt and home to 1/4 of its population, Cairo is both the site of and the theater upon which those large national and international issues have been enacted. A born metropolis, Cairo is steeped in history and tradition. Founded at the strategic head of the Nile Delta as the new capital of the country after the Islamic conquest in 641, the city, originally called Al-Fustat, grew by annexing its northern satellites, as this shows you, Al-Fustat, and then it moves up, and it sort of like absorbs the satellite that have been built over the years. In 969, a rectangular camp was established for the invading Fatimids who came from Morocco, also to the north of the city, and soon became their new capital. It was called Al-Qahira, which means the victorious in the feminine, whence Cairo, its Italian distortion. Later on, a citadel built by Salah ad-Din or Saladin in the 1170s on an outcrop to the east became the center of the newly walled urban area comprising the two extant cities, Al-Fustat and Al-Qahira. Cairo's most spectacular age, however, was the Mamluk period between 1250 and 1517, when the city became the uncontested center of a resurgent Islamic empire and acquired an urban character that synthesized the achievements of previous periods and symbolized the image of the city for centuries to come. Between the 16th and the end of the 18th century, Cairo receded to the status of an Ottoman provincial capital, and it was essentially a pre-modern, oriental, and exotic city that the army of Napoleon entered on the 24th of July, 1798, if we were to believe the French depictions of that imperial conquest. With his expedition to Egypt, Napoleon was embarking on a grand imperial enterprise, carefully and imaginatively planned and executed. Along with the army, he had recruited more than 150 savants, or at least this is what they called them. Most of them were actually dropouts of French schools, many of whom were to form the Commission des Sciences et Arts, and later the Institut d'Égypte. The Institute had two main objectives: to propagate the ideals of progress and enlightenment in Egypt, and to study and publish the natural, industrial, and historical facts pertaining to Egypt's past and present. The first aim translated into the defensive civil and administrative work installed by the new authorities, primarily to secure French control. To fulfill the second objective, the savants systematically collected, studied, classified, and represented all the available material on the history, geography, culture, nature, and fauna of the country. They ultimately produced the monumental Description de l'Égypte, which was published after many difficulties in Paris between 1809 and 1828 in 9 folio volumes of text and 14 grand folio volumes of illustrations, and which formed the basis of the modern understanding of Egypt. The 2 volumes of plates on modern Egypt in the Description, published in 1809 and 1817, contain a selection of measured plans, perspective drawings, and analytical details of important Islamic Egyptian monuments, most of them from Cairo, that offer the first typologically codified analysis of the Cairene architectural tradition. This was followed by the impressive compendium of the French architect Pascal Xavier Coste, L'architecture arabe ou monument du Caire mesuré et dessiné de 1818 à 1826, which focuses exclusively on the monuments of Cairo. Every example is depicted in plan, section, elevations, and interior and exterior perspectives, in addition to short descriptive paragraphs. These detailed analytical drawings allowed Coase to make the leap from studying historical examples to devising a basic vocabulary for a new Mamluk style, which he promoted as the most appropriate for building in Cairo. He tested his views in 2 mosques he designed for Muhammad Ali Pasha at the Citadel of Cairo and in Alexandria. Though never built, these 2 mosque projects may be considered the pioneering examples of neo-Mamluk architecture, with their ribbed and carved domes, tri-lobed arched portals, and hypostyle plans, all arranged symmetrically and with maximum visual effect. Muhammad Ali set the scene for the modernization of Cairo through administrative and hygienic measures, but he did not touch the urban fabric. This was left to his grandson, Khedive Ismail, the impatient modernizer who wanted no less than to visually transpose Egypt, or at least its 2 main cities of Cairo and Alexandria, from Africa to Europe, despite all adverse circumstances. To that end, he created a new Cairo, named Al-Ismailiyya, after himself. This is Al-Ismailiyya, this whole area, and that's historical Cairo. Al-Ismailiyya extended from the medieval city westward toward the Nile, with tree-lined avenues radiating from midans or squares, and modeled after the imperial Paris of Baron Haussmann, which Ismail greatly admired when he visited the Exposition Universelle in Paris in 1867. Ismail was also in a hurry. He wanted his city to be ready for the inauguration of the Suez Canal in 1869, when many European royalties were expected to attend, and he could show off. Hiring designers from France, Italy, Germany, Austria, and Istanbul, and spending huge sums of money, Ismail fashioned an alluring architectural spectacle fronting the old city, complete with all the accoutrements of modern urban living. He built palaces with vast landscaped grounds, an opera house, a circus, one stately mosque, the Al-Rifai Mosque, built in a novel neo-Mamluk style by a series of architects. And he built also hotels and various public buildings. That the long-term aims of Osmanization, so emblematic of modern Western urbanism, were on the mind of Ismail and his public works minister Ali Pasha Mubarak is evident in their oft-expressed desire to instill a new order in Egypt's social and urban structures. It is less clear, however, if they were also aware of the security features of the new planning apparatus, with its creation of wide, straight boulevards that enabled surveillance, military movement, and crowd control. The cutting of two new boulevards in the medieval city fabric, Al-Sikka al-Jadida, which is this street here, and the Avenue of Muhammad Ali, which is this street here, for which it is said that they had to destroy 15,000 medieval structures, does indeed indicate an intention of enacting a system of spatial control. But the plan of crisscrossing the old city with boulevard that would have created a panopticon-like scheme was never completed. Having borrowed heavily from rapacious European banks to bankroll his flamboyant projects, Ismail ended by bankrupting the country and was deposed in 1879 before the completion of either his interventions in the old city or his Parisian-style posh district of Al-Ismailiyah. 3 years later, the British occupied Egypt, ostensibly to straighten the country's finances and to secure the repayment of its heavy debts, but ended up staying for 72 years. The British colonial rule created the conditions for a second and more accelerated expansion of Cairo. New residential districts such as Monira, Sukkariya, Zamalek, and Garden City grew on land formerly belonging to the Khedival Land Holding Company, Ad-Da'ira As-Saniya, which was sold in order to pay off some of the country's debts. Slowly, the city that Khedive Ismail established metamorphosed from a serene palatial district providing an urban frontage of pre-modern Cairo to a bustling metropolis where the two halves, the traditional and the modern one, were joined by commerce, infrastructure, and people's movements. The new economic opportunities and preferential legal codes introduced by the colonial authorities and privileging non-Egyptians attracted large numbers of Europeans and Levantine. The Egyptian called them Shwam, meaning Christians and Jews from Greater Syria, or actually people from Greater Syria in general. These were merchants, investors, and adventurers who settled in the city and built original, playful, even funky domiciles as statements both of their success and their eclectic global perspective. Thus we find Faux Rococo, Orientalized Neo-Gothic, Arabian Nights Neo-Islamic, and even a Neo-Hindu palace designed in 1905 by the French architect Alexandre Marcel for Baron Empin in Heliopolis, a new suburb that Empin was building at the time. Most of these structures were erected by non-Egyptian tycoons who made their fortunes in Egypt and who created what came to be known as the Belle Époque in Cairo, a controversial designation in a city in which the vast majority was living in abject poverty. The subsequent growth of the city also created modernist and classical office buildings and banks where businesses were conducted, apartment buildings of various styles where a burgeoning bourgeoisie dwelt, schools and university where they were educated mostly following foreign curricula, department stores and boutique where they shopped, Cinemas, sport clubs, gardens, cafes, and museums where they could emulate the cultural life of the West. Embassies, ministries, and courthouses where they were represented and governed largely independently of the Egyptian national legal system. Mosques, churches, and synagogues where they worshipped, and cemeteries where they were buried. Left almost to their own devices were the popular and traditional neighborhoods in the old city, where the vast majority of the Egyptian Cairene lived, amid the memories of the glorious past and the neglect of the present, and where further change was slowly brewing. Things came to a head, first with the revolution of 1919, which demanded independence from Britain but did not manage to achieve it. And then with the military revolution of 1952, that for the first time in the history of the country brought a bunch of middle-class native officers to power. It was the first time since the Pharaonic period that an Egyptian ruled Egypt, by the way. Led by Gamal Abdel Nasser, after whom I'm named, as you probably guessed. The British were compelled to leave, and the two dominant social groups, foreigners and aristocrats, saw their power dwindle soon thereafter. The military revolutionaries espoused a mixture of supranationalism, which fast evolved into pan-Arabism, modernism, and a stripped-down form of state socialism. The architecture they sponsored reflected their new political and socio-economic orientation by concentrating on new urban developments. Sorry, are we missing one? For some reason, an image here is not appearing. Imagine some sort of a modernist, very checkerboard-like development. This is what you are going to be seeing. So they concentrated on new urban developments and public projects such as government offices, factories, universities and schools, and public housing, and by presuming that modernist projects can stand for expressions of modernity. The one building that stood both for the aspirations of the new regime and its inherent shortcomings is the behemoth, al-Mugamma, literally the collective, built on the southwestern end of Tahrir Square to house most government agencies. Birth certificates, passports, driver's license, residency visas, and many other official papers can only be obtained there. People burn their nerves through interminable hours of pushing papers from one office to the other in its endless corridors. So no wonder that the building became the butt of jokes for all that is wrong with the Egyptian government. Initially a gift from the Soviet Union to the Kingdom of Egypt, the Mugamma was not inaugurated until after the revolution of 1952, and thus became a symbol of all that was statist, authoritarian, and ineffective in Abdel Nasser's republic. The building, designed by Egyptian architect Kamal Ismail, recalls Soviet-style compounds, but its facades display unmistakable references to the facades of the Mosque of Sultan Hassan, built between 1356 and 1361, this building in here, the most monumental Mamluk structure in Cairo and most modern avant la lettre. Almost simultaneously and resolutely in opposition to the homogenizing tendencies of international modernism, two visionary Egyptian architects, Hassan Fathi, this is the one that I wanted you to imagine, so I put it in the wrong order. So we go now to Hassan Fathi. Hassan Fathi and Ramses Wisa Wasif advanced vernacular architecture as the most authentic representation of the people's architecture. Fathi's principal and famous project, New Gurna village, which was built in 1948, was presented as the embodiment of an authentic Egyptian architecture. In it, Fathi casts the vernacular through a mixture of objective, social, and environmental experiments and lyrical interpretations of an unlikely mix of traditional Mamluk Cairene and Nubian styles that he admired. Ramses Wissa Wasif derived his architecture from a social-religious mission. He was a Christian with a religious mission that found its expression in the new arts and crafts center that he established and built in stages in the village of Harraniya outside Cairo on the Sahara Road between 1957 and 1974. Both architects went on to develop a romantic yet traditionalist formal language that became very fashionable among the Egyptian intelligentsia and later on among the wealthy Arabs of the Gulf. And they applied it in their residential as well as their religious architecture, such as this church by Ramses Wissa Wasif. Meanwhile, the socialist Nasserist experiments of the 1950s and 1960s came to a halt, and the so-called progressive government hardened under Sadat and Mubarak into a tyrannical and ineffective regime whose sole purpose was to stay in power. Demographic explosion, staled economy, and abundant agricultural reforms meant that rural migration flooded the urban centers, especially Cairo, in the 1970s. The city expanded uncontrollably and at unprecedented rate to house the exploding poor urban population in makeshift, informal neighborhoods spread over minimally zoned areas. This is the period in which the world was awakened to the shock of 1 million Egyptians living in the Mamluk city of the dead, mostly in abandoned guest houses built by the wealthy of yesteryears over the crypts of their families. The next significant historical shift, which came after the catastrophic defeat in the 1967 war with Israel and evolved intermittently during the 1980s and the 1990s, was the formation of an ideology that saw Islam as identity. This badly understood and still evolving process has been promoted by at least two economically, historically, and politically dissimilar, though ultimately mutually reinforcing phenomena. First was the re-emergence of a militant Islamic political movement led by the Muslim Brothers after an apparent dormancy of some 30 years, during which Pan-Arabism dominated the political scene in Egypt. Coming on the heels of the victorious Iranian Islamic Revolution of 1979, and perceived as a response to the failures of the nation-state to face up to foreign interference, economic corruption, and moral decadence, the fundamentalist movement sought a return to more authentic political and social foundations to govern Islamic nations. The second group to wield a vision of Islam as a framer of identity, the ruling elite of the Gulf region states, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, United Arab Emirates, and Oman, had a tremendous impact on the trajectory of architecture in the Arab world in recent decades. The wealth that the cities and their citizens were accumulating, their desire to occupy their rightful place on the world scene, their deeply religious and conservative outlook, and their fervent quest for political and cultural identity combined to create a demand for a contemporary, financially beneficial, yet recognizable Islamic architecture. Sincerely at times, but opportunistically at many others, scores of architects responded by incorporating in their otherwise state-of-the-art designs various historical elements dubbed traditional, Arabic, or Islamic, depending on the ideological preferences of the patrons, which the architects often used as basic diagrams for their plans and facades or splashed on the surfaces as ornament. In Cairo, this new architectural trend was bolstered both directly and indirectly by the developments in the Gulf. The enormous Egyptian working force in the Gulf states was coming back with new tastes acquired in their place of business and with cash to translate this taste into all sorts of visual markers, including architecture. More directly, Gulf investors and their Egyptian partners poured billions of dollars into new urban projects in and around Cairo, including new cities whose projected populations is in the millions. The 1980s and the 1990s became the decades of readily identifiable Islamicized postmodern architecture, not only in Cairo, but also everywhere in the Arab world. There were the post-traditionalist architects who, following the visionary Hassan Fathi before them, looked for inspiration in vernacular architecture. But unlike Fathi, they did not build on the social, environmental, and economic underpinnings of the revived traditional forms and restored material and construction techniques. Instead, they brandished their architecture as a kind of native response to both the blandness of international modernism and the Eurocentrism of postmodernism, and in some cases exported it as an expressive regional style, as in the work of Kamal al-Kafrawi, for instance, an Egyptian architect who deploys the badgir, or the wind catcher, both as a visual referent and as an environmental device in his University of Qatar complex built in 1985. In Cairo, Abdel Halim Ibrahim tries to deconstruct the elements of Islamic Cairene architecture in his Al-Hawd al-Marsoud Park, built in 1989, and to rearrange them as imaginary castles in stones for the children. His intelligent use of the Mamluk mausoleum of Salar and Sangar, this mausoleum here, which is built in 1310, as a backdrop of his project, highlights his intention. There are also the free and often arbitrary melange of diverse historical forms and patterns from a wide range of Islamic and local styles, and even un-architectural symbols sometimes. This is seen, for instance, in the Cedar headquarters in Cairo by the Architecture and Urbanism Group of Ahmed Fahim and Hisham Bahgat, built in 2000. Formally and volumetrically symbolizes the Mediterranean complementarity, or more accurately, the intermingling of the Arab world with the European Mediterranean, which is what the building is about. The structure is composed of two intersecting layers, one brick, referring to the indigenous building idiom, and the other glass, indicating the modernity of the European side, or perhaps the global counterpart to the local. Thus, regionalism is clearly given up in favor of a composition that bespeaks the need to espouse the local to the global in architecture. The postmodern trend was not limited to Islamized designs. Pure, playful postmodern projects made their appearance, especially in the gated enclaves that the new wealthy classes built for themselves on the outskirts of the city. Other architects chose to go back in time to the pharaonic past in their postmodern compositions, in a timid revival of a trend that appeared for a short while in the 1920s and 1930s, but disappeared from Cairene architecture afterward. Ahmed Mito's Supreme Court building on the Maadi Corniche is the most explicit pharaonic postmodern project in Cairo, and may perhaps indicate a desire to balance the heavy influence of Islamic architecture on the majority of contemporary public and commercial buildings in the city. It also may be only a stylistic composition by an architect so deeply interested in clear formal references in his architecture. Meanwhile, the real estate fever was continuing apace, despite short halts caused primarily by the tragic denouement of Iraq and the fallouts of the war on terror waged by the US against targets in the Islamic world. The Arabian Gulf awash in cash and eager to diversify its sources of income, presented the perfect combination of willing market and potential partner to global business. Most Gulfi investments focus on building gargantuan business parks and malls, luxury housing in hotels, and touristic, cultural, and entertainment complexes. Architecture at once assumes the role of branding instrument and spectacular wrapping for these new lavish enterprises, which swiftly sprang up around the region and broke all previous measures of scale, form, and at times purpose and urban vision. In this milieu, the architecture of what Mike Davis called the utopian capitalist city seems to have emerged as a tacit design objective shared by the designers and the patrons to lure in more investors in a financial cyclical scheme that seems to have crumbled down in the last 2 years, though it is very early to tell. Thoughtful regionalism, traditionalism, revivalism, and even postmodernism were hastily given up in favor of a new architecture that loudly, and often too loudly, bespeaks the ambition to endow a global pursuit of luxury aimed at the wealthy with sanitized yet recognizable local flavors that Joseph Rickwert matter-of-factly called the Emirate style. This Emirati architectural syndrome spread beyond the cities of the Gulf to the major cities of neighboring Arab countries that cannot sustain this kind of financial, urban, or social price. Cairo, due to its centrality and its size, received the lion's share of these new projects, which come in two variations, sometimes combined in one. Super slick high-rises competing to cut a particular futuristic and exclusive profile above the skyline of the city, or an exclusive excursion down some gilded memory lane of an imaginary but recognizable oriental splendor. The series of high-rises along the Maadi Corniche are examples of the first variation. The new campus of the American University in Cairo, in the suburb of New Cairo, designed by Sasaki Associate of Watertown in Massachusetts in association with Abdel Halim Ibrahim, is a loud example of the second. Similar large projects are underway, although the January Revolution halted their operation just a little. However, the effects of these economic and urban conditions are felt more harshly in the older and poorer neighborhoods of the city, including the historical core of the city, misleadingly named Islamic Cairo. The decay of these historic neighborhoods has been accelerating under the weight of severe population growth and heavy rural immigration, accompanied by an assortment of governmental neglect and corruption, greedy real estate market, and chaotic zoning and overbuilding, and more recently, the exodus of the remaining businesses and pockets of bourgeoisie living in the core of the city to the new cities rising on its peripheries. Cairo definitely deserves a more sensible urban management that balances the requirements of preservation and development. After all, the deterioration of the historic core is a direct outcome of the overall mismanagement of the contemporary metropolis. Moreover, the myriad restoration projects done thus far did not conform to an overall plan of urban conservation, which in turn was not discussed until the late 1990s. In fact, it is only in the last few years that we can speak of a rhetorically articulated vision and not yet a clearly spelled out policy, which moves from conserving individual monuments to advocating the preservation of the old city as a living and economically viable social and physical entity that happens to possess the world's richest Islamic architectural heritage. The first actual project to adhere to this vision is a Darb al-Ahmar revitalization project. For some reason, it refuses to show you that project. See? It sort of like jumps on it. Here, we stand there. Sponsored by the Aga Khan Trust for Culture, an ambitious undertaking that aims at no less than to rehabilitate and reinvigorate this substantial historic neighborhood in the heart of Cairo. The project was initially envisioned as an offshoot of the Al-Azhar Park, another grand project funded and executed by the same agency on the nearby Darrasa Hills. But early on in the process, it was observed that a modern landscape project such as Al-Azhar Park, complete with lavish touristic services and a restored 12th century wall as a backdrop, could not border on a dilapidated and depressed, though historically rich neighborhood. Moreover, it was realized that only a strategically planned rejuvenation of the urban surroundings could ensure the survival of the park at that critical location in the ever-growing metropolis. Thus began the involvement of the Aga Khan Trust for Culture with the Darb al-Ahmar district. But the revitalization project soon took on a relevance of its own as an integrated experiment in urban conservation that involves serious investments in the welfare of the neighborhood and the upkeep of its infrastructure, services, as well as its historic monuments. This, however, remains only one project, and incomplete at that, in a city that counts at least 8 other equally important and equally dilapidated historic neighborhoods and many more 19th and 20th century districts. But the most alarming effect of this relentless movement of people and capital is neither architectural nor urban. It is rather the fading away of their civic quality that was slowly and painstakingly acquired over the last 2 centuries, and its replacement by a relentless market-driven commodification process, which is robbing the old poor quarters of the last vestiges of urban life and turning them into contiguous village-like neighborhoods, living by their own informal codes under the authority of locally grown chieftains. Therein lies both the opportunity and the challenge Cairo is posing to the revolution of January 2011. Thank you.